I've noted how today's increasing political and social polarization is putting the need to succeed in our efforts toward cultural maturity's new common sense in high relief. It is the topic of my most recent book, Perspective and Guidance for a Time of Deep Discord. With issues of every sort, people today are dividing almost immediately into polar camps. Often with particular issues, it's not at all clear in advance that there is any reason for conflict. All we know is that division will happen eventually and result in absolutist advocacy from both sides. Conflict between ideological factions today has become so pronounced that real conversation about a great many topics has become largely impossible. In the book, after examining what we see more conceptually, I address specific issues where polarization today too often prevails: climate change, healthcare reform, abortion, race and gender relations, immigration, and more. Many others besides myself who attempt to make sense of the human condition have pointed toward the danger this circumstance presents. Extreme polarization is sitting neighbor against neighbor, creating distraction that gets in the way of addressing essential questions and often very directly putting us at risk. Of particular importance in these reflections, extreme polarization makes culturally mature understanding essentially impossible. And more we find a particularly troubling kind of double polarization, not just extreme polarization between left and right on political positions, but with populist thinking on both the left and the right at once, an anti-authoritarian polarization between above and below. We see such polarization twice over becoming ever more pronounced and people's voices becoming ever more shrill. Before we turn to some of those specific polarizing issues, in this episode I will touch on a topic that provides important perspective. It highlights a recognition that is needed both for getting beyond today's knee-jerk polar animosities and for understanding how culturally mature changes provide an antidote. In the end, ideology has less to do with what we think than how we think. Ultimately, it's about something more basic even than the collections of beliefs and values, what people refer to with a term like worldview, though that gets us a bit closer. At its most fundamental, ideology is about psychological patterns, or more precisely, patterns of cognitive organization. It is not so much that belief creates polarization than that polarity's role in how we think creates polarized belief. As a psychiatrist, in working with individuals, I am used to listening less to a person's specific words than to the underlying psychological implication. I listen to where the person is coming from. Ultimately, I'm interested in the patterns of psychological cognitive organization that generate a person's beliefs. In my role as cultural psychiatrist, it comes naturally to listen in a similar way. The notion that social political polarization has more to do with our cognitive mechanisms than the real complexities of policy can easily come as a surprise. We tend to think of our opinions in terms of rationally arrived at conclusions, and the media tends to take at face value that what a person says is generally what he or she means, or at least that the words adequately reflect what drives the person's concerns. But the recognition that we are dealing with underlying cognitive pattern is key. It is pivotal to making sense of why getting beyond polarization can be so difficult and why efforts at civil discourse so often fail. And if the concept of cultural maturity is accurate, it is essential to understand what is needed going forward. Cognitive dynamics are not all that beliefs are about. The particulars of belief can in fact be products of reasoned consideration, and beliefs can be influenced by numerous external factors: where we live, for example, urban versus rural, the family we grew up in, or the unique challenges our particular life may have presented. But belief quickly translates into psychological pattern. We can think of these patterns like ecological niches in the makeup of our psyches. Different kinds of social narratives fit most comfortably into particular cognitive niches. Some of the best evidence for the conclusion that ideology has less to do with what we think than how we think can be found in the common intractableness of people's opinions. We tend to assume that when people have views different from our own, that the appropriate response is to engage in reasoned discussion and debate. In fact, debate rarely changes anyone's mind, as often the result is positions becoming even more entrenched. We also find evidence in how issues that eventually become highly polarized are often not thought of in partisan terms at all when they first come to the public's attention. This was the case, for example, with both climate change and healthcare reform. There were no obvious sides to the climate change debate when the evidence first came to light, and the approach on which Obamacare was initially modeled was Republican Mitt Romney's plan in Massachusetts. We often encounter related surprises with us versus them antagonisms on the world stage. It turns out that wars are less often the result of major differences than we tend to assume. Think of how World War I began with the assassination of Austro-Hungarian heir Archduke Franz Ferdinand. While it was a significant event, few people had any idea it could have such world-altering consequences. We find an important further kind of evidence in the common closeness of elections. If voting were based on the perceived intelligence of a candidate's ideas, much more often than we do, we would see general agreement as to which candidate is the most qualified. Instead, elections are most often won by a few percentage points or less. This is what we would predict if we are dealing not just with differences of opinion, but opposed, polarized cognitive patterns. Pushed to extremes, polarities split 50-50, like two sides of a coin. One of the best ways to win an election, if you are not really qualified, is to create controversy and polarization. Because polar opposites tend to split about evenly, you would then be able to get something close to half of the votes. We also find evidence in the almost inverse relationship that exists between how informed a person is and the likelihood that the person will have strong views. If surety were a product of how thoroughly topics have been researched, we would expect the opposite. But in truth, we commonly find the most adamant and shrill opinions and the most lengthy pronouncements coming from people who in fact know the least and have least to offer to a real conversation. Less information more quickly aligns with cognitive patterns. More information risks creating internal dissonances. It turns out that if we have sufficiently nuanced conceptual tools available to us, like those provided by creative systems theory, we can make pretty accurate predictions about the ideological beliefs that we will encounter by teasing apart psychological structures and patterns. What we can then predict is underlying values and narratives, not particulars when it comes to specific questions, but this kind of observation can prove immensely useful. At the least, it helps us make sense of otherwise confusing results, such as how people can have views that would seem not at all to be in their best interest, or how often we find strange bedfellow allegiances. It also helps us appreciate what the more encompassing kind of understanding that comes with culturally mature systemic perspective involves, and just what it requires of us. In Perspective and Guidance for Time of Deep Discord, I go into more detail about both how polarization works and what is required to get beyond it. A simple lesson provides the architecture of the book. In times past, When we encountered polarized positions and partisan advocacy, our task was obvious and unquestioned. We assumed that there were only two options and that our job was to figure out which one was right and fight for it. As we look to the future, polarization has very different implications. It alerts us to the fact that we have yet to ask the hard questions that ultimately need to be addressed. When we succeed at asking the larger questions, we see that there have always been more than just two sides. We also see that while each traditional side may hold a piece of the truth, neither side by itself, not just some averaging of positions, can get us where we need to go. Moving forward effectively will require bringing greater maturity and more encompassing perspective to how we make sense of our worlds and how we make choices. In the book, besides specifically addressing an array of issues that commonly evoke polarized responses in our time, with each issue I demonstrate how more systemic perspective is possible. I also emphasize, as I have with all these episodes, that when we are up to the challenge, the results seem straightforward, even obvious, in the end, like common sense. As always, I invite your thoughts and questions.